Professor Pramod Nayar teaches at the University of Hyderabad. He is the author of so many books that I won't bring them out. Pramod is one of the most prolific academics that I know. And it comes as no surprise to me that he was awarded, last year he was awarded the President's Award for the Best Research in Arts, Humanities and Social Science, which is quite an award. He has been working on travel writing since he was a postgraduate. Is that when I first encountered you? Or after your PhD?
Yeah,
after, yes. He has he's worked on that field for a long time. Anyway, today his paper is called Vernacular Cosmopolitanism in the Age of Empire. It says chapter 4 above it. I'm delighted to pass the microphone over to him now.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks primarily to Rita for persuading me to come. I'm not very easy to persuade to travel, though I'm interested in travel writing. As people like Shogata here would know very well, who tries very hard to bring me into JNU and I don't. Thanks also to Kate, whose work when it first appeared was a bit of a hindrance for me because I was trying to finish my doctoral and along comes this book. And you dislike a book which appears at the time that you think you can submit and be done with it. And Kate's book appeared at that time along with Sujit Mukherjee's. And India Inscribed has been very influential in the work I have done, as also Jean-Paul Ruby's work along with Andrew Hatfield and others on travel writing. So it's a matter of privilege to be here. I am speaking today, and it will have a chapterish feel to it because it's a chapter from a forthcoming book on Indian travel writing 1830 to 1947. I did a couple of years ago a 5-volume set on Indian travel writing from 1830 to 1947, primary texts, and this grew out of that. And I'm interested in people starting somewhere from around 1840s, looking at different kinds of travelers, proselytizers, industrialists, shipbuilders, travelers of leisure and recreation, who went to various parts, kings and princes also, who went to various parts of the world. Today's work focuses primarily on Europe, but there are most of these travelers incidentally also traveled to New Zealand, Africa, some traveled through Arabia, Japan and the East, Tagore in particular, and the Far East. Several of them traveled through the United States as well. So this present chapter focuses primarily on the European segment of their travels. Vernacular Cosmopolitanism in the Age of Empire. I begin with a small quotation from A.L. Roy, sometimes written as A.L. Raya, Reminiscences English and American, 1888, who states, the chief value of travel in foreign countries is to enlarge one's ideas, to make them broad enough for approximation with the ideas of other nations. And he says, to make one cosmopolitan, in a word. Cosmopolitan, not necessarily in habits and manners, but in sentiments, sympathies, and aspirations. That, in effect, sets the tone for what I have to say. Like aesthetics and Occidental exoticism, cosmopolitanism reconfigures the imperial subject, traveler, and the components of this cosmopolitanism is the subject of what I want to say. In reframing the view of the imperial subject as not entirely subject to the empire due to these are primarily male travelers, due to his attitude of, if at least nascent forms of cosmopolitanism, I draw upon Babacar Mbey's reading of W.E.B. Du Bois's Cosmopolitanism, where she argues that there's an attempt to balance a romanticization of the European metropolis along with his de-idealization of that same nation as an emblem of colonial subjugation. So Du Bois, as she argues, is caught between romanticizing Europe as a cosmopolitan place, but also as a place from where colonialism begins. The Indian traveler's cosmopolitanism has many layers and nuances, not to mention ambivalences, that may be productively read as part of the process of reconfiguring the so-called imperial subjectivity of the traveler. And this traveler's cosmopolitanism is double-edged. it looks towards Europe and England and looks towards India as well. Most of these travelers will begin by saying it was one of their big dreams to actually travel to London, to see London, to experience London. And they would refer to it as Mother Nation, the land of our masters. All the colonial tropes are in play. And then what they do there is what interests me. Elsewhere, I've argued that most of these people arrive there as very informed travelers, and what I've characterized as informed enchantment. They're enchanted by England, but they're also extremely aware of it. So the inevitable feature of these texts is somebody like G. Parmeshwaran Pillai, who travels 1910. Any part of the English, Welsh, Scottish countryside he goes, he's able to cite a poet from that region. So he arrives in Edinburgh, and for reasons one can't quite understand, cites Walter Scott. Then he of course, cites Wordsworth all the time. Every region, he knows the poets from that particular region. And the others as well, who are traveling with more or less amazing levels of knowledge and familiarity with England in terms of habits, language, dialects, literature, politicians. They're enchanted, but it's not wide-eyed wonder any longer. By the time we look at the travelers from the 1880s, they arrive in England ready to meet what they are to be enchanted by. I do not know whether informed enchantment works as an oxymoronic construction, but that's precisely how it operates. They are aware of what England is, what England has done, what England's credentials are, what its literature is, what its cultural practices are, and they say, wow, yes, this approximates to what I have always known about this. So it takes away the edge of wide-eyed wonder. An additional layer to the double-edged perspective is an affective and ethical perspective that many, but not all travelers bring to their gaze when observing the working class poor in Europe. That's something else that I've discovered. They invariably focus on the injured, the disenfranchised, and the poor in Europe. And I'll have something to say about that. So there is a romanticized view of the economic and political power of England. People like Ramesh Chandra Dutt will speak about England as the heart of an empire, and then qualify it by saying, but you see, the heart needs its other mechanisms, its limbs, its arterial system. All of those are in the colonies, and seem to suggest that England's heart can only thrive when the colonies feed into it. There's a very biomedical metaphor that they seem to use. So there's a romanticized view of the economic and political power of England, its history and culture, but tempered by quiet reflections on the nature and source of England's power, colonialism and exploitative racisms. This drives, the first component drives a romantic cosmopolitanism, where an informed one, as I said, where the Indian traveler is equipped with considerable knowledge and responds enthusiastically to the imperial country. The second one, which causes the traveler to look back at his own country and at the working classes, refugees, or the urban poor in London, informs a different form of cosmopolitanism, one which, following Nina Werbner, Homi Bhabha, and others, I call vernacular cosmopolitanism. The tension between the romantic and vernacular forms of cosmopolitanism is a productive one, for it resists the imperial subject traveler's complete assimilation as a colonized subject, and is not just going to convert him into a cynical cosmopolitan. The folding of the romantic with the nationalist, the transnational with the national, and the political with the affective constitutes the vernacular cosmopolitanism of Lala Baijinath, Behramji Malabari, Romesh Dutt, and other late 19th and early 20th century travelers. Indian travelers like Jagatjit Singh or Lala Baijinath. Jagatjit Singh was a king. Lala Baijinath was a judicial officer. Occupy a very peculiar liminal space, being both migrant elites, and in the morning, Rubius spoke about aristocratic analogies. They dine with princes and queens and ambassadors and wander around London. The Raja of Kolhapur goes to Oxford Senate Hall, and he says, everybody stood up as though in my honor. Actually, it was not quite for him. But the monarch of England had walked in. But the Raja of Kolhapur says, oh, they all stood up for me. How nice. Then he visits a rail coach factory, and he says, they make trains there, but I did not buy any one. You know, the wealth playing out. He's not a colonial subject in that sense, and they dine with European ambassadors and royalty and socialize globally with all of these people as equals. And when they turn their attention to the laws of England, they recognize that they in India are treated unequally. In England, they dine with the aristocrats, but in India, they are colonial subjects. They admire England's progress and social mores, mourning that such is not quite the case in England's colony. This is what is a liminal state which colors their vernacular cosmopolitanism. There's also a significant quantum of what Sheshalata Reddy, looking at Sarojini Naidu, calls cosmopolitan nationalisms, where cosmopolitanism is not incompatible with national feelings and patriotism. There is a fair amount of cultivated partiality, which is embodied in a reflective return to cultural origins, but to which one can no longer return in an unthinking manner. Vernacular cosmopolitanism does not abandon one, that is the native or the local, in favor of the global and the universal, but engages in a dynamic that complicates the relations between the two, a dynamic embodied in the traveler itself. Vernacular cosmopolitanism foregrounds the traveler's national identity, and nationalism is layered with an interest in the subalterns of other nations, the cultures of poverty in Europe, and the fragile social ontologies of the underprivileged in various parts of the world. This is a constituent of what I shall, in the later part of my talk, term moral and sentimental cosmopolitanism. I'll first turn to what John McBratney, in his reading of Dickens's Great Expectations, proposes as a mediating cosmopolitan condition that leads to some kind of partial universalism. He suggests that Victorians typically looked outward to enlarge the empire and also towards rural England, and were not entirely comfortable with the fluid national identities of the age. For the Indian traveler in England, we can make a similar case. The aesthetic produced by the simultaneity of two worlds, England and India, and two subjectivities, colonial subject and the informed ethnographic traveler, is a cosmopolitan one. It's also a geopolitical aesthetic in which many of the travelers are conscious of England's global position. Each one of these travelers, like I mentioned before, also visits various European nations, Australia, the United States, and very different parts of England, such as Scotland and Wales. Thus, the visit to England is part of a much larger itinerary broadly called the West. Rather than a destination, England sometimes functions as a stopover, a median point, and quietly erodes the uniqueness of England as a destination. G.P. Pillai refers to Parisian beauties and charms. Jagjit Singh's travel narrative charts an exhaustive journey through Egypt, Italy, the Alps, Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, Paris, England, and New York, and covering all the major cities and cultural capitals. Jindaram travels to Paris, Turin, Florence, Rome, and Milan. Baidyanath's narrative has a chapter devoted to his travels in Switzerland, Egypt, Italy, and another on his Sri Lankan sojourn. N.L. Dawes's travels take him through England, Sri Lanka, Tasmania, New Zealand, and Australia. So as you can see, it's not just a colonial periphery, colonial center, but it's a much larger spread across which these people are traveling. I have suggested thus far that travelers like Pillai sought to acquire a cultural insiderness, facilitated by their knowledge of England itself and a memory citizenship of the empire through an informed enchantment with things English. This informed enchantment was consistently underwritten by the double vision of looking at England and India and seeing in England points of comparison and contrast with India. Writing about London at night, Pillai describes the scene as an enchanting sight. He has also just come back from looking at Westminster Abbey, where appropriately he quotes Wordsworth's poem. He not only appreciates the sights and beauties of England, he even describes them in English terms and a language directly borrowed from English poetry. At this point, one can ask how and why these texts seem to embody aesthetics such as the picturesque or the sublime, which is what I've argued elsewhere. But it's very clear from the language that they use to describe these places that they are well aware of the language of European aesthetics, which they employ constantly to talk about the Alps. So Ramesh Chandranath, who visits Norway, looks at the vast banks of snow and ice, and he says, this is a truly spectacular sublime. And the discourse, the aesthetic discourse, is almost entirely what you can find in late 18th and early 19th century European aesthetic traditions. But there is something else that goes on. Mediating cosmopolitanism enables the Indian traveler to tone down his appreciation of England by comparing it to other parts of the world and not very favorably. Dawes is disappointed when he sees St. Paul's Cathedral and he says it's grimy and sooty. And he says the walls of St. Paul's in Calcutta are far cleaner and nicer. He makes a similar comment about the Bank of England as well. And he says, for the Bank of England, it does not have the imposing look from outside which the Bank of Bengal seems to have. And you see this constantly being reiterated. The Indian king's jewellery room is far richer than the jewel room of the French castles and the Tower of London. Pandian, an indefatigable explorer of English housing, notes the appalling conditions of the London poor, and he devotes 4 pages to the poor housing conditions of London. He devotes about a quarter of a page to Buckingham Palace, but 4 pages to the poor housing of London. He's disappointed by the Houses of Parliament as well. And nothing seems to impress Mr. Pandian. He looks at Whitehall, the India and Foreign Offices, the Home Department, the Colonial Office, and other public meeting places, and he's not very enamored of those. He seems to be suggesting constantly that these buildings are not worthy of an imperial civilization. This might be read as an act of demystifying the wonder of imperial London that simultaneously underscores the encomium of a colonial subject and the fragility implicit in the edifice. Baidyanath, who comes to the Houses of Parliament, as he says, with feelings of awe and reverence, end quote, admits that, quote, there is not ordinarily much eloquence in the House. In fact, they are all disappointed by the level of parliamentary speeches. We understand that. And that he was, quote, somewhat disappointed with the way in which business was transacted here. He perhaps expected that the House of Lords and the House of Commons would have a very high degree of rhetorical flourishes. At one point, he notes that English society is too great a worshipper of nobility. And then he says the Englishman is as great a supporter of caste as the Hindu. He's categorical in his criticism of the British government as well. The British domestic servant, turning elsewhere, writes Pandian, is much better than the Indian one, since in India, integrity and efficiency cannot be said to be commonly characteristics of the domestics. Integrity and efficiency cannot be said to be the common characteristic of the domestics. He might be well describing university systems in India now. Pillai speaks of the incorruptibility of the English policeman. The other thing that attracts everybody's attention is the railway system. Practically every traveler I know documents the number of cabs, the number of trains leaving Paddington. There's a whole array of statistics that they provide, what I've elsewhere called the enumerative picturesque. Mediating cosmopolitanism is characterized by considerable self-reflection. The Indian is an observer of England, but is also at the same time an observer of India when he travels abroad. Like I said, there is a constant attention to a certain level of nationalist discourse as well, to talk about India's past glories and its scriptural traditions and things like that. So there is a constant slippage between the admiration for things English, things European, kind of toning down what Cormac McCarthy in The Road would say, a counter-spectacle of things winding down, not things building up, but things winding down. And there's an emphasis on a certain kind of romantic historicism, as James Chandler would put it, on dating these buildings and then saying, well, they're not quite up to the mark, are they? No? Then there is another angle to their cosmopolitanism. They recognize the significance of something as wonderful as the British Museum, and then notes that they're collections from Egypt, Greece, and other countries. So that's what makes England very great. They are able to get material from various parts of the places. And we do now know that only 10% of the British Museum's treasures were acquired legitimately. The rest of it was stolen. This form of cosmopolitanism, where the Indian not only admires England but also critiques it, even as he reflects on comparable examples from India, is not a top-down abstract cosmopolitanism. Instead, it's a cosmopolitanism that is born of very particular transnational experiences. It's also in many ways restitutive. It restores to the colonial subject, who's otherwise just a subject, a sense of moral and social authority, commenting confidently about English culture, being self-reflective about his identity as an informed Indian in England, and offering internal criticism of India as well. So there are 3 ways of doing this: to show that I'm aware of what you are as a nation, as a civilization, by pointing to India's own sense of greatness and history, and offering an internal criticism as well. That's mediating cosmopolitanism. I now want to turn to something peculiar to many of these texts. Empathetic perceptions of the East emerged in European texts through the 19th century, but were essentially focused on specific classes of natives where the Europeans observed, interacted with them. As David Cannadine famously argued that after 1857, and Professor Ruby has mentioned this in the morning, and I just quoted aristocratic analogies about social hierarchies which the English were very interested in. And Cannadine argues that they saw their empire as an extension of their own social world rather than in contradistinction to it. So they were quite happy to work with and meet people of their own social standing. But that's not all there is to many of these travelers. There is a moral cosmopolitanism, a mode, perception, and perspective cultivated by the elite Indian travelers that enabled them to make simultaneous and dialectical moves. First, it inserts them into a social hierarchy of compassionate, concerned, and well-meaning elites across European empires. Second, and in contrast, it caused them to engage with Europe's subalterns, a move that was implicitly a process of fashioning solidarity with similar others. Moral cosmopolitanism begins as an interest in the subalterns, in the disenfranchised and the poor. This is a kind of contrast to what has happened before. Having dined with the elite, then having looked at expensive stores, expensive places, and things like that, you suddenly see many of these people focusing attention on working class and the poor, and of course war victims, which is central to many of these narratives. They look at war memorials. I suggest that the encounter with the poor, with the working classes, enables a specific move, embracing such groups into the political and social imaginary as subalterns. Mary Louise Pratt rightly argues that in sentimental fiction, political uncertainties are resolved in the sphere of family and reproduction. For the Indian traveler, it becomes, I suggest, a solidarity with the lower classes of Europe that carves out an entirely different kind of contact zone. Such a subaltern zone in England is different from the one in India, where, even with the illusory coevalness of rank between English and native elites, the zone underscored racial hierarchies between the two. In England, for instance, Jasavala notes that there's a whole bunch of shop girls who get down from the omnibus every evening. And she says, "To see these girls was to love them. So beautifully fair and young were they. I was forcibly reminded of those tales in which even kings were willing enough to be led in silken chains by girls of plebeian birth." Shop girls come in for attention by Behramji Malabari as well. And he says, quote, "My impressions of London shop girls in this respect are more favorable. Whether at the shop, the open stall or booth, or in the restaurant, they have as a rule dealt fairly with the stranger, sometimes generously. Poor little things, hungering for a kind look, a kind word, which they seldom get." Malabari's focus, one notes, is not on the girls alone, but on the social order that pays them extremely poor wages. And you see this, a whole series of them in Malabari's chapter titled "Life as Seen in Public Affairs." Talks about poverty, and then he says, "In London itself, there are hundreds of thousands of people who have a daily, almost hourly struggle of it to keep body and soul together. Hundreds of them may be found every month on the pavements, on the roadside, on house steps, starved, cramped, or frozen to death. Hundreds die every month for sheer want of means to keep alive. Thousands drag on a miserable existence, embittered by disease, from which death too long delayed is the only relief." This subaltern cosmopolitanism, I propose, is a variant of Mary Pratt's idea of the anti-conquest. She defines anti-conquest as a system of representation that eschews the general trend in travel writing. I expand the term's semantic scope to signal the imperial subject's rejection of imperial authority and conquistadorial rhetoric, and replaces it with a moral connection and the appropriation of difference into a multicultural, sentimentalized social imaginary. Here is Chichi Chandra Banerjee's encounter with a friendly young woman in London who directs him to his residence when he is lost. He is writing in the 1930s. And he writes, "She is a German Jew. It was very painful to learn that she was one of the many who fell victims to Hitler's wrath. I was greatly moved when she related in reply to a query of mine how she was forced to leave Germany with a paltry sum of only 18 shillings and how she had to struggle hard for maintenance for months and months together in a foreign land. And later he will talk about the Sino-Japanese War, where everybody is talking about it, and the sympathy of the average people, he says, was always with the ill-fated Chinese. Banerjee's attention across these 3 pages, and 3 pages are full of attention to victims, is entirely consumed by the examples of people belonging to races and nationality who were, at that moment in history, persecuted: German Jews, Chinese civilians, and African Americans. That Banerjee's text foregrounds these population and individuals points to the idea of a subaltern sociality at the heart of London. S. Natarajan, traveling much later, in the 1940s, discovers that in Germany, nobody wanted to discuss the Jewish question. And immediately, everybody changed the subject, he says. In England, when he, that is Natarajan, went to speak to an Englishman, he recognizes that as an Indian and imperial subject, it is a deep feeling of humiliation that I cannot speak as a representative of one free country to another. There are plenty of these examples. So, in short, you see in these travelers an instance of multicultural suffering being foregrounded. There are Jews, African Americans, all of whom are victimized. Then there are the working classes of England. Subaltern cosmopolitanism is a form of anti-conquest and moral affiliation of the Indian traveler with subordinated populations and their memories. The insulting portability of races that other people face when the English clerics announce, for instance, that at one point, Cornelia Sorabji documents that the English cleric describes her as coolies. Have you met any Indians before, she asks. And the English cleric says, yes, I have met some coolies from South Africa. Aren't you the same? And she's offended at the portability of race. The larger point I wish to make is that each individual history, whether of poverty in England's streets or of Maori alcoholism or American racism, is read in terms of other such histories. When Malabari witnesses hungry boys and girls on the streets of London, he pauses to reflect on the famines in India. He says, hunger in England is as keen as the thirst in India. It is in London that I can realize the havoc of famine in my own country, the semi-starvation of 40 million people in India year after year. There must be thousands in England too. The observation and citation of one incident and condition in the light of others is an archive of multidirectional memory, to borrow a phrase from Michael Rothberg. Such an archive is the very foundation of the traveler's self-fashioning. She or he functions as a moral subject of the empire, whose moral response towards suffering in any part of the world and the discursive inventorying of this suffering is the basis for a new subjectivity. Elsewhere, in the sentimentalization of poverty, Parmeshwaran Pillai, G.P. Pillai focuses on the working class as well and is looking at flower dealers and sweepers. And he draws attention to the scrawny physiques, the weariness and the general air of decrepitude that marks the working classes. The focus on vulnerable bodies captures, in the light particularly of Judith Butler's work, the universal injurability of all humans, even in distant Paris or the capital of the empire, London. Sentiment here, and a sentimental response, is central to the generating of moral cosmopolitanisms. And this is how they engage with distant multicultural others. When Romesh Chandra Dutt says of the Irish farmer, quote, "This is not the only fertile country in which the cultivators are exceedingly poor," he is making a larger case for global poverty and concomitant ethical responses. There are other such moments as well, and I'll quote one more example. And it's a very peculiar example. This is N.L. Doss on his Paris trip, where as soon as he arrives, and for reasons which are never elaborated, his friend who's supposed to conduct him on a tour of Paris first takes him to visit the Paris morgue. Like I said, there is no explanation why the morgue becomes the first halt for a tourist. And he says, I quote, "I passed through the vestibule and was all at once ushered into the presence of 4 dead bodies, 3 males and 1 female, which were exposed there behind a glass screen for identification." You can imagine what my feelings were then. All cases of suicide, murder, or accidental death are exposed there for identification by the friends of the deceased. I was told that there was 1 case on the average per day of deaths in Paris, and that house is never without 1 or more bodies on view. And then he says, besides these bodies, I saw several hundred photos of men and women who had died thus in the 2 previous years and had not been identified before. And then he concludes, these facts do not speak much to the credit of the morality of the Parisians. Maybe that's the purpose of, I do not know whether Anyone here, I have certainly not had experience when you land in a particular place, the first visit is to the morgue. No? My argument is related but not quite identical. It's the repetition of the figures of dispossession and disenfranchised rather than any one character that constitutes the moral dimension in people like Pillai and Das. I suggest that the emphasis on poverty, the feature of much poverty porn in the contemporary as well, by the Indian traveller is directed towards two ends. First, it points to the frayed social ontologies even in cities like Paris and London. And two, it's part of a much larger cosmopolitan project which mobilizes sentiment about the distant others. It's not a question of personal grief. It's not a question of saying, oh, that's a terrible situation for that particular individual to be in. Instead, what they do is talk about the much larger social conditions which produce death, to borrow Membe's terms, a situation devoted to the production of death itself. Some, of course, offer suggestions as to how this can be reduced. And in line with what Sonia's paper was talking about in the morning and anticipating what Kate will speak tomorrow, there are people who talk about how we can help England. T.N. Mukherjee proceeds to make a set of interesting observations, and his suggestion includes, we have millets and seeds which yield as nutritious a food as wheat, rice, the pulses, and the potato. Create a demand for these, and the vast expanse of land now hung fallow in Chota Nagpur, the central provinces, central India, Mysore, Assam, and others, will smile with a verdure through which will peep the white bunches of jowar, kodo, chua, and the brown claws of ragi and its kindred. He who has seen with his own eyes the sufferings of the needy when famine raged in India, or the chronic hunger that prevails among the poor classes in Europe, has no room in mind for another feeling than the ardent wish to alleviate human misery. And he suggests that once you cultivate more of these crops, you can ship them to England and alleviate the famine in England as well. Mukherjee's moral cosmopolitanism, maybe it should be called botanical, imbued with sentiment in the form of shock and sadness, leads him to reverse the colonial imperial philanthropic mission when he claims that Indian grains and pulses can alleviate the situation of the hungry poor in England. A sharp contrast from Jonathan Swift's, a modest proposal, of course. He proceeds to demonstrate that being poor in England is infinitely worse than being poor in India. He does not elaborate why. Like Das's opinions about Parisian morals, Mukherjee attributes the abject state of the working classes in England to its social structures. The expression of sentiment towards the subjugated, oppressed, and destitute classes of people across the globe may be seen as not only the enunciation of political affect, but also as the mobilization of public sentiment around a range of structural and other inequalities in the world. I'll conclude here with my last section on national cosmopolitans and cosmopolitan nationalists. When one reads Behramji Malabari's The Indian Eye on English Life, we encounter a double vision in the way he perceives himself, England and India. Despite his imperial subject position, he gains access to people, places, and events through his education, networks, and relative privilege. Acutely aware of this, he fashions his cosmopolitan stance towards England as a pedagogic locus of his political aspirations. The cosmopolitan nationalist, I suggest, folds the pedagogic and the performative, to adapt a binary from Homi Bhabha. First, people like Malabari recognize the colonial pedagogy of the empire constituting the people of India as subjects within a particular historical past. Second, and herein lies the layering of the traveller's complex cosmopolitan nationalism, figures like Malabari, Dutt, Das, and Baidyanath also treat England's political structures, rules, and laws as offering lessons for Indian society itself. Malabari, for instance, says, we should perhaps adopt more of the English social mores so that our women are more emancipated. The Indian traveller draws the lessons for a performative for the colonized race, Indians, in terms of reforms, political and social, and writes from the imperial center he is traveling through. The performative is not necessarily one that India needs England to bestow, but one that, as the traveller's internal critique of his culture suggests, Indians can undertake for themselves. The first and third mark his nationalist, native, localized position. The second signals his cosmopolitanism. Take, for instance, Pillai's point about the operations of gender role in England and India. He says that increased interactions with women when traveling through England means that, quote, you cease to be nervous in the society of women and you are no longer shy. He continues, you meet with women of different intellectual caliber. You begin to admire their mental culture and to like their company, charmed by their manners and easy conversation. And then he critiques India. In India, you found it so difficult to separate real, genuine affection for a woman from passion and love. And you sought the company of only one woman, your wife. That was due to your training and to the sort of society that exists there. But society as it exists in England makes you admire women, free altogether from the grosser form of love, he leaves it unspecified as to what the grosser form of love is. The more you move in the company of English women, the more you are convinced that it is possible for you to admire the intellectual culture of your friend's sister or even her personal charms without harboring any unholy thought in your breast. Society as constituted in India, he says, does not recognize this distinction. Pillai's comparison foregrounds several aspects of the social that arrests our attention. He shifts between a you, which references himself, the Indian traveler in England, and the third person, implied reader in India, addressed in the form of a second-person narrative. In the process, he makes a second move from the stereotypical views of man-woman relations in Indian society to the possibilities of a different kind of those same relations. I see this as an instantiation of a vernacular cosmopolitanism in Baba's sense of the term. Pillai, for instance, engages in what Baba characterizes as a parallaxal shift in the subject of the event as the enunciating eye shifts its geopolitical location and rhetorical locution. That is just so that you know that Baba writes like that. Homi Baba's key point here is that it is in the very ordinariness of the everyday that we become unrecognizable strangers to ourselves in the very act of assuming a more worldly or what is now termed global responsibility. People like Pillai, I propose, use the scene of everyday interactions in England to speculate on the socializing of genders in India, even as he shifts the rhetoric from the you that refers to you himself to the you which refers to any Indian male. He retains the specificity of historical context, as Baba would insist, when he speaks of the revisioning in two clear pair mirrored sentences. As he puts it, Pillai, society as it exists in England and society as constituted in India. He makes that division very clear. The cosmopolitanism that enables Pillai to assimilate England's modernity of gender roles is not just imbued with a sense of wonder at cultural difference, but as a clear nationalist agenda of reform within India. It's not enough to conclude with this extract that appears to fit so well with the global responsibility, however. Behramji Malabari, writing a few decades before Pillai, records his views of England and gives a detailed, there's another chapter devoted to the women's reforms, especially the question of parda and marriage, and berates India's primitive attitude towards this. Having made these comparisons wherein the East is indicted for its narrow-minded attitude towards gender relation, Malabari sets out to modify his views, and this is what he says. Long courtships and flirtations are certainly not to be defended. But though flirtation is to be reprobated in all cases, there are many cases in which courtship is permissible as a prelude to wedded happiness. Early marriages are best suited to our present requirements, though there is no excuse at all for infant marriages. So he has covered all bases, more or less. Arguing for, against, arguing 6 sides to an equation which has only 2. This is the cultivated partiality, a reflective return to the cultural origins that one can no longer inhabit in any unthinking manner. I quote Amanda Anderson on Cosmopolitanism of the Indian traveler. Malabari, impressed by the advances he sees in England, and England has having made in terms of gender equity, recommends the same reforms for India. Even as he crafts his subjectivity in terms of the observer, traveler, commentator on English life and culture, he distances himself from it by pointing to the potential pitfalls of courtship and socializing. So the subjectivity of the traveler is precisely this productive, cultivated partiality, which leads the Indian traveler to constantly renegotiate their terms of engagement with the foreign culture and their own. Cosmopolitan nationalism emerges in several other sections of the travelogue to compare when they compare British garments in Britain and that in India, and they say, why is it that Britain, which is so obviously democratic and nice to its subjects in England, does not replicate these structures in India? And the comparison is always, of course, not in favor of the English. In most cases, they also reverse what Burke famously called geographical morality. G.P. Pillai, for instance, proposes that what is minimally acceptable within the boundaries of the English nation is absolutely not acceptable and is downright reprehensible in the context of the subcontinent. Pillai projects race-based exoticism as a spatially restricted phenomenon, even though within the countries of Ireland, England, and Scotland it is widespread. He says, there it is all right, but you can't do that to India, can you? Racial inequality and exoticism, he implies, is not portable across the seas into the colony. It's all right to be nasty towards the Welsh. Discovering the problem of race for Pillai involves a transnational engagement and exposure from the subcontinent to England. Cosmopolitan nationalism also appears in these texts as an insistence on social reforms in India, founded on cultural codes and literacy, gleaned not only from just England but also other countries as well. Baijinath, for instance, visits two societies in London, the Vegetarian Society and the Society for Prevention of Blindness. The former, he discovers, is making some headway amongst the working classes. He then mentions the tensions between Hindus and Muslims in India over the practice of eating beef. Sounds familiar. He expresses the hope that if Indian youngsters adhere to their old habits, they would enjoy better health. And he's saying, look at the young. Why are they not following these old traditions? And constantly discovering that there is some merit in old-fashioned, old-school, conservative Indian attitudes as well. While there is some jingoistic nationalism at work in many of these texts, T. N. Mukherjee claims that there's a certain antiquity to Hinduism which is on par with Confucianism and Christianity as well. There's also a cosmopolitanism of a certain belief system, and someone like Mukherjee will argue that each has borrowed from the other even in the ancient world, that these were not solely originating within the Indian tradition alone. The global register of progress is not always, however, enunciated in the report. Travelers like Syed Ahmad Khan were also thinking in terms of other identities, and talks about Muslims here and Muslims in Arabia, and the Ottoman Orthodox regions around Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and other places. Syed Ahmad Khan praises the education of women in the areas around Syria, Lebanon, and others, and in Egypt, and concludes with, it's a matter of great pleasure to see the increased mutual love and diminishing hatred and savagery of human beings. He's referring to the Arab world. Syed Ahmad Khan fits into what Seema Alavi famously described as Muslim cosmopolitanism in the age of empire. Seema Alavi, examining Muslim fugitives in the post-mutiny India, demonstrates how these individuals found the space between the British and Ottoman empires as conducive to remaking the global, as something that was non-British or non-Eurocentric. That's precisely the point I'm trying to make, that when they focus on vernacular cosmopolitanism, most of these are shot through with hybrid genealogies, not just white British. It adapts from various European sources, and most of the national cosmopolitan or cosmopolitan nationalist attitudes attains a reflective distance from his home and from the world. This distance enables, I argue, a kind of reflection, which in many cases focuses on subalterns in various parts of the world. So at one point, a traveler who arrives in New Zealand looks at the Maoris and says, they have all taken to drink. No wonder wherever the British go, they induce people to drink. And this is a pattern that repeats across these travels, that there is a strong emphasis on the disenfranchised, which helps the Indians say, but look at what the Europeans have done. While the critique is not always made explicit, I am proposing to you that the way in which the rhetoric operates is to suggest that imperial modernity as characterized by England is not quite all right. And a vernacular cosmopolitanism seeks to turn their learning from foreign shores into an advantage for India as well. And this positions the traveler as a pivotal figure in nation building. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pramod, for that fascinating and really wide-ranging paper. As always, you cover an immense amount of material. So, does anyone have a question? We have about a quarter of an hour. Or have you all been dazzled by that display of... Yes.
Awareness of global poverty, and I was just interested in knowing how did they view India, because didn't it sort of make them aware that how they themselves have been treating the Indians? There's so much poverty in India, and obviously the domestics that they're referring to, they're much worse than the shop girls.
No, they do. They show remarkable self-reflexivity in these matters. And they do say that poverty in India is terrible. But it's a good excuse for them to blame it on the empire. So a lot of what happens in India, the poverty, the famines are as a result of that. What they do is to say that, oh, but you know what, there's poverty in London as well. And then they look at all the injured war veterans whom they encounter. Ramesh Chandra Dutt, traveling through some part of England, which I forget now, looks at a war memorial. And he says, in that war, and he writes this description, the number of people who died who are not English, and he gives a number. And the attention being constantly deflected away from English, except where the English are responsible for subaltern suffering. It's fascinating. And they will talk about the fact that one person says, an equal number of French lost their lives in that battle with England. And this is a bunker from that battle. That is a memorial. And somebody else encounters, quite similar to Blake's London, an injured soldier on the streets. And then you use that to speculate on what has war brought home for the English, suffering. So I found that particularly interesting, that instead of just reveling in the glories of the land they wanted to visit, you reach there, then you look at St. Paul's and say, that's grimy. And then you look at the people saying, oh, they're terribly poor. So there's no glorification of the empire on its own.
Could I just ask you a question? You mentioned there Blake, and I was just wondering, do you think in any sense that this interest in poverty, particularly London poverty, might be also literary in Dickens, for instance, or Mayhew? I mean, is there a sense that this is also what you come to do, and you are also kind of coming to discover Dickens's London as well as the London that is the mother country and all the rest of it?
I definitely think so, because my sense when I read these travelogues is they had come prepared via the literature of that period and had more or less got the cultural geography of England down. They knew it. And it's a bit like those, I think it's Joseph Addison who says he goes to Italy and he looks at the Leaning Tower and he looks at the travel book and says, it's not quite as good as it's described here. Trying to match what you see with what you have read. And these people seem to find it, oh, so there is poverty, so this is Dickens's England. There are no direct references to Dickens except that when they go to Westminster Abbey, they see the inscription on the stone for him. But it does seem to me that if they have been reading so much of, say, Wordsworth on the poor or Blake on the poor, there might be a literary route into discovering England's.
Underside.
Yeah. I definitely think so.
Yeah. Yes.
So I come a little late, but the topic interests because when you talk about British, they have ruled here for about 250 years, have a relation of 450 years. We had relations with French also, we had relations with Portuguese also. But it is not all the way pessimistic. They have some certain qualities of education, innovation, which now they are in forefront, in the vanguard, along with Germans and France. So everybody is bothered. So how far when you say that you are, they have done, every ruler does something wrong, whether it is your own native ruler or it is princely states, anywhere. So they want to squeeze your money everywhere it happens. But we have to see in the holistic perspective. So still they are making some headway, although they are, deep down troubles, and they are appearing to be in a splintered form or in disintegrated form. But when you see their educations and your, the determination, you find there is something which can take them out. So how far you compare the two, because you are a learned man and a professor, and so let's take both the views, and can you explain both the things?
I don't think there's a matter of dispute or contestation at all. For me, what struck me about these travelers is twofold. One, they begin with the assumption that you are visiting a place of great. You're visiting a place of great prosperity, and then you say that not quite. So you get a little tainting done on the glory of the empire. You use that to reflect on your own country's drawbacks. They do admit that England gave us the following things. They say that. But they also admit that there's a problem with the way the colonization has proceeded. But as I said in response to Rita's query, they are also aware of the fact that a lot of the suffering within the Indian society is of our own making. They say that. Except, of course, the Rajas who are traveling, who are not likely to be saying, I am responsible for the poverty of my citizens. The others do say that. So, Das and Pandian, for instance, who are very interested in housing and the urban poor, talk about the fact that the local kings in India did very little to remove poverty. Neither have the British. So, at one point, leveling them as equally culpable in the poverty which is India. Which is what I said, the kind of ambivalence that marks their moral cosmopolitanism is really fascinating. And they do not, at most points, say that they're just proud of being imperial subjects. They all begin that way. But the narrative doesn't take it very far. Most of them are, the ones I've referred to are between 1880 and 1940. Kshitij Chandra, Kshitij, Chandra Banerjee. That's around 1930. Yeah. Natarajan is east of Suez, is around 1942. Just around that time. Yeah.
I would like to supplement one text. There was one lady, Bengali lady, Jyotirmala Devi.
Mm-hmm.
She was from an obscure place, but her father was rich.
Mm.
So before her marriage, she went to England. And it is a travelogue, but comes as a story for Milet Deshta Market. England is made of art. And there, derives the people there. That they are, cheap, the landed is how to give these people. The underlying tone is always to downgrade the people.
Right, okay. Yeah, there is a lot of such criticism. G.P. Pillai, for instance, he was an editor of a newspaper from Kerala, Madras. He will tell you that you can trust the cab driver in London. Even if you lose your things, he'll get it returned. Above all, trust the London bobby, the policeman, but never trust the English landlady. He's very emphatic about it. And in sharp contrast, Karsatji Marwanji and his nephew, they go to England in 1830s to study shipbuilding. They tell you the one person you cannot trust in London is the cab driver. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Nayar. I really enjoyed your paper. I was just wondering, these little vernacular cosmopolitanisms are actually created within India as well. It's not like when they go to a different geographical space, which is England, in this case, which you described at length. I'm just wondering, for example, Raja Harishchandra, would have had that cosmopolitanism, vernacular cosmopolitanism, different from Raja Ram Mohan Roy, since his association with East India Company and so on. So I'm just wondering how that panned out in India vis-a-vis there. Is there a lot of difference between when they travel actually, or is it's all established here, as you said? They have these dichotomies which were...
That's a fascinating question. We need to see if they did similar narratives about traveling through India. But because they were all interested in looking at Videsh, as they describe it, you will see a lot of it in Tagore, actually. Tagore does that quite substantially in his texts. When he's writing even the Java travelogues, he does that. But others didn't travel. There are touches of it in Bholenath Chandar's writing from 1857 and after, where he does have this sense of when he's traveling all the way down, and he's traveling at the time of the mutiny. And he does have this sense of being aware. And I would think vernacular cosmopolitanism is primarily about an awareness, which is, I think, where you are also headed for. And how it plays on in India would be good to look at also if you can discover vernacular texts that do this. These are texts in English. And this text that you've mentioned, I do not know whether it's available in the English translation. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. There's a Jasawala, Cornelia Sorabji is, of course, there, and Ramabai and others. But would you be able to trace this in Indian language travelogues of the 19th century? That might be a keener way of juxtaposing these texts with that. Or is it that vernacular cosmopolitanism emerges when you face an imperial formation like Europe? That would be good, but I am not equipped to look at that. But it might be, yeah.
I'm just pointing out to the fact there exists the internal contradiction even before they go out.
Yes.
That's what I'm pointing out to. Even at the end of the 18th century, as early as that, and early 19th century, there is already a ground prepared for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Just pointing to that.
Yeah, but I would still think that if you're able to get all of those texts, it would be fascinating.
Well, I'm aware that we are coming up to tea time. I don't know how strict we have to. I'm looking to the organizer. Okay, yes, please.
Well, in the travelogue, you have explained so many things, but the English people came here because of some trading in the initial stages for 150 years, and they remained here for 150 years doing only trading with India. And they moved into Northeast and moved all around the country to find out what is something acumen in the Indian psyche that they built up a trade. But is there any account of their investigation into travelogue? You could get my point. They came all the way for trading. Later on they built up an empire, and they were fascinated by the way of Indian psyche of trading. And they loitered around to Northeast and other parts, and Gujarat and other parts of the country. But do they mention in travelogue the intensity of acumen of Indian trade to which they have learned, or they have said anything great or worse for them?
Oh yes, that's more, I think, Kate's area actually of European writing on India. But yes, they do. In fact, what's interesting is they will invariably list towards the end of their travelogues the currency, weights and measures, distances. There's an inventory that they provide. Then they will talk about how transactions are done in India. And for instance, there is Ralph Fitch traveling through Belgaum in 1583. And he will say that it's a very peculiar marketplace. Precious stones are being sold on the streets of Belgaum. So many of those people are, and they do make a note of the fact that Indians are pretty astute as traders, and they will identify communities which does that as well. You will see that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as well with the Afghan and the Northwest, because the moneylenders are traveling out from the Gujarat area, and the European transactions with them are generally very fraught. And they also have a problem with the way Indians kept accounts. They said, where are the ledgers? So the Indian merchants would tell them, we don't necessarily keep ledgers. So accounts, I think you yourself make the point about the word account used in the travelogue. They were always called travel accounts, but the word account works for both purposes. They keep accounts as well, and it's an account of something. But they were fascinated by the Indian systems of trading. They did say that Indians did not always understand certain kinds of value, so which is why Ralph Fitch is astonished at the precious stones being sold on the streets. But they identified communities as well. Yes.
I'm sorry, I forgot your name, lady. So, is there any major difference you notice between Muslim cosmopolitanism and other vernacular cosmopolitanisms?
The Muslim travelers I know that I'm looking at here, Syed Ahmad Khan and Syed Sulaiman Muhammad, they are not very different in what they say from the other vernacular cosmopolitans. The other ones that you see, Siwan Murphy's translation of the Nawab of the Begum of Bhopal, she's going to England and via Saudi Arabia. She, in fact, is angry with the Saudi Arabian Muslim interpretation of Islam. And she's primarily, I think, annoyed because they say your baggage will also have to be subject to customs checks. And she says, I am royalty, you can't do that to me. And she says they treated her badly. But for the most part, I am not quite sure there is a difference. Seema Alawi's work does something else. She is looking at the formation of a transnational Arab knowledge production system between the scholars who fled India after 1857 and tie up with the scholarly debates and debating societies within Saudi Arabian Gulf region. And she argues that there's something else going on there. There is a kind of Islamic nationalism that arrives there, but it's primarily transnational. It's entirely contingent upon knowledge societies. So these are people who go there and do enormous amount of scholarly work with manuscriptures and stuff, which is a different category of cosmopolitanism, I would think. Because Alawi notes that the Wahhabis and the Devbandis who had to flee India in the wake of 1857 were actually fugitives in the subcontinent. So their cosmopolitanism emerges from a different thing. In partial response to what Jyoti was saying, these are elite travelers.
Right.
So Syed Ahmad Khan, founder of the university and all that, and Shah Sulaiman Muhammad are extremely wealthy people. So Sulaiman Muhammad, I think he's the one who says that. He's offended that he doesn't get the right cabin on a ship. And he says, I'm not being treated right. So you can see the elitism getting to be the foundation for a vernacular cosmopolitan of this kind. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We just express our appreciation for a fantastic paper. And I believe it is now tea. Just outside? Just outside. It says tea.